the biggest hedge fund in the world for a long time. And in order to do that, you've had to kind of think about the rest of the world in a systematic way. And in doing that, you've developed this framework for understanding what's happening now and what's going to happen. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of set the stage with that, the 5 trends that you look at in order to think about what's going to happen.
As a global macro investor for like 50 years, I found that some of the times I was surprised was because of things that happened that didn't happen in my lifetime before. So I needed to go back and study history. And in studying that history, that helped me a lot. And there are 5 major forces that operate in a big cycle. And those together, they operate in that big cycle. And those 5 forces are, first, there is the money, debt, markets, economy force. And we now have a debt issue, a big debt issue globally that is very important. That's a force, that financial force. The second force is the internal order and disorder force that goes in a cycle in which there is then greater and greater gaps and conflict between the left and the right and populism that forces a great conflict like a civil war, which I believe we are in a form of civil war now that's going on within countries. The third is the great world power conflict, that when a great power runs the world order and then there's a rising power that challenges that, you have a great power conflict, US-China. Number 4 is, throughout history, is acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars and have toppled more orders than anything else. And now we have climate and the acts of nature, which are a big force. And the 5th big force, all through man's history, is man's inventiveness, particularly of technologies. And that everything that we talk about, everything that we are looking at falls under one of those, and they move in a largely cyclical way, and that is the framework that we now are living out.
So you just laid the basis for the world's most interesting 6-hour conversation. But since we have, amazing, since we have 17 minutes, I want to zero in on one. And but before I do, let me say, it feels like we're at the tail end of a cycle or the beginning of a new cycle.
Yes.
Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes.
The famous 80-year cycle. So this is obviously a pivot point. If we could just start with the first, debt. Can you give us a scale, a sense of the scale of global debt right now?
It's now unprecedented in all of history, and I want to just explain that how it works. There's a supply-demand situation. The way the debt cycle works is think of credit and our credit system as being like a circulatory system. That credit brings buying power, brings nutrients to all of the system. But that credit that we buy things with, we buy financial assets, we buy goods and services with, creates debt. And that debt accumulates like plaque in a system that begins to have a problem because it starts to squeeze out spending. For example, the US budget, about $1 trillion a year now goes to pay interest rates. And over the next year, we're going to have over $9 trillion of debt that we have to pay back and roll forward, hopefully. So there's a supply-demand issue with this debt. One man's debts are another man's assets. And if those assets do not provide an adequate return, or they feel that there is risk in those assets,
yes,
there's not enough demand for that debt, there is a problem. And that problem is that interest rates then start to rise, and those holders of the debt begin to realize there's a debt problem, and worse on this supply-demand is that they have to sell the debt. Imagine if you thought your assets are not good, you're going to want to sell those assets, and that creates this terrible supply-demand balance that produces a great conflict. Now, the central bank can either let that happen, interest rates rise, asset goes down, economies suffer, or they come in and they print a lot of money. At the end of the day, they print a lot of money, and as a result, you have a monetary inflation type of situation. That's the situation we're in. We're in that situation. It is so critical in terms of the supply and demand. When I calculate the supply and demand over the next year and 3 years, we have an immediate issue.
In the next 3 years?
Yes.
Can you be more specific about what that issue is? Like, what does that look like if not addressed in the next 3 years?
It looks like the holders of the debt and the buyers of the debt will not buy enough to meet the supply, and as a result, interest rates will rise. As those interest rates rise, that has an effect, of course, on the economy and so on, but it begins real problems, particularly when asset prices are now fairly expensive, and so you have that dynamic taking place. The central bank then is put into a position, does it print money and buy that shortfall? And when it does that, then there is the depreciation of the value of money that produces a monetary inflation. In any case, there is a movement from this treasury market, which is the backbone of our whole financial system, to be, there is a trauma in that. And then that affects all markets, and then money as a storehold of wealth as we know it is in jeopardy. Is not in jeopardy, it's depreciated. So there's an issue of debt is money, money is debt, and if you have a supply-demand problem,
yes,
and it's not good to hold that asset, you're going to have the selling of that asset, and you're going to have that kind of spiral. And we needn't do this. Okay, it's alert, but the existing, I'll speak of the United States, but a number of countries face this issue. The United States will run a deficit of about 7.5% of GDP if the Trump tax cuts are continued, which I expect. And that deficit needs to be cut to 3% of GDP, must be cut to 3% of GDP. All policymakers and the president should have a pledge to get it to 3% of GDP, because otherwise we're likely to have a problem. And that can be done.
Sure, but I mean, you're talking about a pretty compressed timeline. I think most Americans are thinking this is in the distant future. You're saying it's imminent if it's not addressed.
It looks like, the way I penciled these numbers out, it looks like it's a 3-year type of timeline, and you also have to do the adjustment, the cutbacks, and make that adjustment. You have to do it when things are relatively good, and you have to do it promptly, because otherwise the debt accumulates and the debt problem gets worse. It's like if I'm speaking with you about your heart. I'm a doctor. And I'm talking with you and I'm saying, okay, Tucker, you have this situation. Okay, the plaque is there. You're in a high risk of this heart attack, essentially. Now, what are you going to do about it? Here are the things. Maybe it's exercise, maybe it's this and that. But in one way or another, you've got to do this now, because you're in better health now. Don't wait for this to happen and then try to make it better.
What's striking about your diagnosis, though, is when I hear that, I'm thinking, well, in my 80s, I will address this. You're saying I do it by summer vacation or I die. So
well,
we have a new administration in the United States, and they are setting about, very famously over the last 3 weeks, cutting a lot of wasteful spending. The Doge project under Elon appears to have the full support of the president. If they were sitting here, what would you say that they need to do within the next year to address the crisis you think is right around the corner?
There are many ways to get the number down to 3% of GDP. So you've got to have, and there's a lot of politics about that.
Well, yeah.
But everybody should say, whatever way you get there, you've got to get there, okay? So now the question is, are the cost cuts going to actually be able to produce that? You have to take sharp pencils And you also have to think, what are you going to break along the way? Because you don't want to break too many things along the way, but you've got to do it fast. So, how much is cost cuts? How much is interest rates? Interest rates are an important influence on the debt because we're paying so much in interest rates. So how do you affect the interest rates? If you do this, you'll improve the supply-demand picture, and you'll have lower interest rates, which will contribute. So I think you have to say, you have to deliver. How much can you deliver from each of those things without breaking too many things that are going to be problematic? And we can go down, if I was then having that conversation, you can go back to the items. Don't let the ideological aspects of this be so much that you don't achieve the goal.
So can you give us a couple of examples? I mean, I think the idea, which some say is a fantasy, is that you could get to 3% through cutting discretionary spending, wasteful nonsense, et cetera. But it doesn't sound like that's correct.
You know, that I don't see it.
Yes.
Okay. But it gets down to the particulars. If you can go through and say, I'm not going to unacceptably break these things and I'm going to achieve those things, and that's the case, great. And then there is truth in the fact that new technologies are going to bring about efficiency.
Yes.
And if quick enough we make increases in income and increases in productivity, there are benefits to be had from those things too.
Yes.
Okay. But there is an unknown factor there, and it looks to me like each one of those having enough effect in a quick enough period of time is unlikely, or or if you want to do it, I would say, then recognize that you're responsible for the consequences. And if you don't pull this off and there's a problem, that you own it.
Having seen this in smaller countries a couple of times, I wonder if in the United States we ignore the effect of these questions on stability. I mean, what you're really doing is rewriting the social contract when you make certain cuts. Like, people expect, the government's going to do X, Y, and Z for me, and all of a sudden the government says I'm not going to, and then you get political volatility up to and including, violence. This has happened in many, many countries. So is it scarier to you, the debt crisis that you described that's right on the horizon, or the potential blowback from making cuts that, the population really doesn't want?
I think the question is how tolerable it is. I think we are at this big risk thing, and a lot of decisions have got to be made quick.
Yes.
And so you've got to go ahead and be right and make those decisions, and then you find out what's tolerable. I think that probably since achieving that must be of paramount importance, then you do it, and that's the best thing that you can do.
Make the decision.
Go do it. Get the 3%. And you can do it if you realize there are three factors. There's taxes, which I say taxes, not tax rates, tax income, which also comes from it.
Of course.
From the fact that if the world is earning more, there will be more tax income. Okay, so there's taxes. There's spending. Cut the spending in various ways. Cut it down as far as you can, and that becomes tolerable. And then there's interest rates. And if you do the first two, you will have lower interest rates. This magnitude of change, which is roughly a 4 to 5% change in GDP, a fiscal tightening of 4 or 5% in GDP, happened between 1992 and 1998.
Right.
So it's been doable. If you get that mix right, you don't create too much shock in any one of those, it's achievable. But it has to be done now.
So, not to blame anyone or look backward or anything, but when historians assess, like, the 100-year period that we're living through right now, how important will they weight the dramatic drop in interest rates, the price of money, after the financial crisis? We had this long period where money was super cheap. Are the problems that we're dealing with now the direct result of that, do you think?
Yeah, there were two big surges. Well, let me say, since 1944, there was a healthy period where debt taken on produced enough income to service the debt.
Right.
That's good. That's healthy.
Yes.
That's not a problem. Everybody benefits from that. Then we got into a period of time through these various cycles that more debt got taken on than incomes. And so when you need income to service the debt. And so that rose for a long time. And the crescendo of that took place in the two big fiscal stimulations that took place first in the COVID and second in what was a big transfer of wealth where the government borrowed a lot of money, send out checks, and then we had the rise in inflation. Oh, surprise, you send out all these checks.
You weren't surprised?
Of course not. You send out all this money to everybody, what are you going to...
The Treasury Secretary seemed completely shocked by it. Like, really?
I mean, it's basic, okay?
Yeah.
So, okay, now we are where we are in that spot. And that's not just the U.S., okay? That's the world,
yes.
Okay? So what I'm talking about is that it's a world problem, it's a China problem, it's a Europe problem, it's a world debt problem. But I want to go back to my also 5. That means it's an internal political problem, okay? Because if you have that problem, that debt problem, you exacerbate the great conflict that's going to happen.
Yes.
You create political instability. It's a geopolitical problem, a debt situation at the same time as there are conflicts internationally, geopolitical. Climate is costly. Roughly $8 trillion a year on climate. So it's a financial thing. And now the question is this new technology and how we're going to handle that and what, how do we make the most to raise productivity, or what is it used for? Is it used for conflict?
I sincerely think we could go to dinner and everybody in this room would be much smarter. But we only have a couple of minutes left. So if I could just connect 1 and 2 just for a second. So what you're describing, the need to get to 3% of GDP, okay, like now, I'm wondering if you can do that. I'm speaking specifically of the United States with the system that we currently have. It feels like if all the 5 factors are connected, they're all converging at once in this 80-year cycle. I mean, is our current political system, or the one that we had, the first week of November of last year, is that the system that is going to allow this level of change?
I think the administration, but there's the United States, there's Europe,
yes,
there's all of these places that are facing the same issue,
yes,
okay? So it's difficult to speak that. I think the administration is going to be dealing with this more, and then the question is, okay, how practical is it in terms of achieving those things? And then also, can everybody take the 3% pledge? Like I think if we all could get together and everybody says, I'll own it, I'm in government, I'll own it, and then find out also, like a backup solution, if you were to basically say, if we can't agree on everything, we'll do it proportionately across everything. Something, but it has to be done. Otherwise, Tucker, it's like the heart attack thing,
A lot of people have heart attacks.
A lot of them are
because they can't face it.
A lot of them are preventable.
Yeah, of course, but they happen anyway because people just don't want to deal with it, or they think it's going to happen in 20 years, but it happens in 20 minutes.
I think as we step back, the important thing is that we don't just react to how we feel. Like we feel good in the moment right now. There's a lot to make us feel good in this moment.
Yes.
Okay? And that we pay attention and realize the mechanics. So that's why I wrote, and anybody who is interested, I wrote a piece online that'll be a book. It's called How Countries Go Broke, and it shows the mechanics of the process. And numbers, and shows, okay, here's the debt service, here's what it's like, here's the supply, demand, and all of that. It's online, it's free. And what I'm trying to have people do is say, is that true analytically? Is that right? Or what is wrong with it?
Yes.
And then if you embrace that, is it right? If it is right, what does that mean if you're a bondholder or a government or whatever? Be aware study it, and then deal with it.
Last 30-second question. If we're here 4 years from now, you're describing a world that's changing even faster maybe than most of us think it is. How different do you expect the entire global landscape to be in 4 years?
I think we're going through a time warp. That you are going to see not only the debt, the internal, the external changes, the changing world order as we're talking about, the changes in technology and what that's going to mean for our lives, artificial intelligence and so on. It's almost going to be like going through a time warp, and we're going to be in a whole different world. It's going to be shockingly different in that time frame.
I'm moving to Greenland, which thankful we will own by then. So I'm going to miss a lot of that. But Ray Dalio, thank you very much.
Thank you, too.